Now we're going to start looking at the parts of the endocrine system. We've looked at how it's made and all the different structures, and we've looked at what stimulates these endocrine organs and what effects the hormones can have. But now we want to look at the individual ones, and we're going to start out with the hypothalamus. You remember this is up in the diencephalon of the brain. It is the king of the endocrine system. It creates actions, but it's not likely to go out and do it itself, okay? It's the king. It's vital to maintain homeostasis, maintains our regulation of hunger and thirst, our fluid balance, our body temperature, our sleep-wake cycle, and some reproductive functions. It has a close anatomical and functional relationship with the pituitary gland, and they work together to maintain homeostasis. So whereas we call the hypothalamus the king of the endocrine system, we call the anterior pituitary as his head guard. He tells the head guard what to tell all the other glands and cells in the body to do. Because the hypothalamus, he could go out and do it himself, but he's not likely to. He'd rather go through his head guard, okay? Now, if we look at the structure of the hypothalamus, and this is going to be hard to do because I'm having to draw with a mouse, but the hypothalamus in the brain is this region right here that looks like a funnel in the diencephalon. And it connects by a stalk that's called the infundibulum with the pituitary gland that sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Let me go one slide further so you can see. So here is the funnel shape hypothalamus, and then you see the infundibulum, the stalk, and then you've got the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland has two parts. It has the anterior pituitary in the front that, I didn't mean to do that, but here, this part, that is the true endocrine part of it, okay? It is the part that we call the adeno, which means gland hypophysis, and that's another name for the pituitary. It is the gland, the hormone secreting part of the pituitary gland. The posterior part that's on the back side of it, back here, that doesn't make any hormones. It's called the neurohypophysis because it's got some nervous tissue in it. Now, there is a specialized blood network that connects the hypothalamus with the pituitary, and it's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. And it allows the delivery of hormones as well as blood, okay? It's called a portal system because there's two capillary beds in the system. And if you look here, you can see what I'm talking about. You see right here what we're talking about. You see how it goes through the infundibulum? That's where we are. Now, no hormones are actually made in the posterior pituitary. It's more for storage. So we think of it kind of like if we're sticking with the medieval analogy, we've got the king, the hypothalamus, the head guard, the anterior pituitary, and then the posterior pituitary, those would be the grain bins where they store the grains. It stores hormones. The hypothalamus makes two neurohormones that get stored and then released later by the posterior pituitary. One of these is antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and this promotes water retention. It helps maintain our water balance by controlling how much water is released from our kidneys. It's produced in pretty much the same amount, very low levels, and it moves through to the posterior pituitary and gets stored in synaptic vesicles. But the axon terminals don't have synapses. They will instead release the ADH when they need to into the blood vessels when they are stimulated. And that ADH will cause these little water channels called aquaporins to be inserted into the plasma membrane of the cells in the kidney tubules so that water will pass into the cytosol and then back through the extracellular fluid and finally to the blood where it can be eliminated so it won't be eliminated from the body as urine. Oxytocin is the other one. The hypothalamus makes this and stores it in the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin is mainly for reproduction that targets the mammary glands and the smooth muscle of the uterus. When a mother's nursing, the suckling of the infant will stimulate oxytocin release so that she will have milk ejection. And it stimulates this milk letdown reflex where the more the infant suckles, the more milk is produced. And it stops when the infant stops suckling. So here you can see this pathway through the infundibulum for the release, the hypothalamic hypophyseal system for the release of hormones and so forth, whether they're inhibiting or exciting hormones that are going to be released through there and go to the anterior pituitary, and then for storage they go to the posterior pituitary with the ADH and the oxytocin. A lot of functions to do with homeostasis are controlled by the hypothalamus, and it affects the anterior pituitary, the front part, the hormone endocrine part of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus makes and releases tropic hormones. Remember, they affect another endocrine gland, and they will stimulate if they're called releasing hormones, or they will inhibit if they're called inhibiting hormones. And it stimulates the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. It's telling the anterior pituitary to release, for instance, thyroid stimulating hormone, to tell the thyroid to release its hormone, or it will tell the pituitary to release thyroid releasing hormone to stop it. Okay? Now, they all are going to travel through that hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. Many of the anterior pituitary hormones can also be tropic because they will control other glands throughout the body. You have 5 releasing hormones that say we need to release a hormone, that the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary what to do with these releasing hormones. And then you've got 2 that are inhibiting hormones. The hypothalamus will release thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, to the anterior pituitary, and it will stimulate release of something, or corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, or prolactin releasing hormone, PRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, or the last one, growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. I know that's a lot of letters. It also, hypothalamus releases somatostatin to inhibit release from the anterior pituitary, and prolactin inhibiting factor to inhibit the release of prolactin. So hormones of the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and their target tissues are maintained by negative feedback loops that happen at multiple levels or tiers. So the endocrine system will control things very tightly within the body to maintain homeostasis by using these tiers of control. Let me give you an example. A tier has a stimulus, a receptor, a control center, and a response by the effector. The first tier would be the neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus secrete, releasing and inhibiting hormones in some sort of response to a change in some homeostatic variable. Water balance, hunger, thirst, that's a tropic hormone, okay? The second tier, the tropic hormones from the hypothalamus affect the anterior pituitary and either stimulate or inhibit it to secrete a hormone. That's the second tier. The third tier is the actions of the anterior pituitary on the target tissues. It will cause the target tissue glands to either secrete hormones or to stop secreting them. That's the third tier. And this ends when the hypothalamus determines that whatever variable of homeostasis is back at the normal set point. And then it stops secreting the tropic hormone. And when the hypothalamus stops, the anterior pituitary will make adjustments as well. And then the target tissues make adjustments as well. So you have 3 tiers of control. Now, remember, the anterior pituitary is getting directions from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary is our head guard, and the hypothalamus, the king, tells it what to do. And then that anterior pituitary gives the directions to other cells and glands throughout the body. If it gets thyrotropin releasing hormone, if that comes from the hypothalamus, then the hypothalamus secretes thyroid stimulating hormone to stimulate the thyroid gland. If the anterior pituitary gets corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, it will release adrenocorticotropic hormone to stimulate the adrenal gland and the making of steroid hormones from the adrenal gland. If the hypothalamus sends prolactin releasing hormone, then the anterior pituitary will release prolactin to stimulate the mammary gland. If it gets prolactin inhibiting factor from the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary doesn't release the prolactin to stimulate the mammary glands. If the anterior pituitary receives gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, then it will release luteinizing hormone that will stimulate the testes in a male so that more testosterone is made, or in a female, it'll stimulate the making of estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries. if the anterior pituitary receives that gonadotropin hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, then it will also, the anterior pituitary will, in addition to luteinizing hormone, releases follicle stimulating hormone. And that affects the testes of the male to make chemicals that can bind and concentrate that testosterone. And in the female, that follicle stimulating works with the luteinizing to cause the ovarian follicles where the ovaries sit to mature. And it makes estrogen. And the last one, if the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone or somatotropin, that will act on the thyroid gland. And you have peak secretion of your growth hormone from the thyroid gland during sleep, when you're asleep. Now, looking more at this growth hormone, the main function of growth hormone is it targets the skeletal cells, the cardiac muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, the cardiac muscle cells, the adipose tissue, the liver, cartilage, bone, and it can produce either short-term effects or long-term effects. The short-term effects would include anabolism, building molecules, and catabolism, breaking down molecules. So it's metabolic. It will cause us to make more glucose in our liver, and it'll keep our muscle fibers from taking up this glucose so that we have an increase in our blood glucose levels. The long-term effects are not directly mediated by growth hormone, because what growth hormone does is it acts on the liver and other target tissues and promotes the production of another hormone called insulin-like growth factor, IGF. And what this does is it will extend the half-life of growth factor, because without IGF, our growth hormone is used up within 6 minutes. But we can make it last longer, which promotes more muscle development and regulates our body mass more with the IGF that works with it. And that's just a table that goes through everything that we've just discussed. And of course, this table is in your textbook.